In my assessment, Vladimir Putin is winning. Russia is winning. They're winning in Ukraine, but they're also winning the battle of influence against the West. They're winning in the face of economic sanctions. They're winning. Empirically, when you look at the math, they're winning. So when you ask me whether or not Putin is getting good information from his intelligence services, when I look at my overall assessment of multiple data points, he must be getting good information. Do I know how or why? I do not. The reason that there was no support from the West, because let's not forget, there is no support. There is nothing other than the Lend-Lease Act, which is putting Ukraine in massive debt right now to the West. That's the only form of support they're getting from NATO or the United States. So if somebody believed Ukraine would win, if somebody believed Ukraine had a chance, they would have gotten more material support than just debt. And we can jump into that anytime you want to. But the whole world miscalculated. It is absolutely sad. I am not in any way, shape, or form saying that my assessment on this is enriching or enlightening or hopeful. It's just fact. It's just calculatable empirical evidence. The real risk gain scenario here for Russia is significantly in favor of gain over risk. The other thing that I think is important to talk about is everybody is trapped in the middle of a gigantic information war. Yes, there's battlefield bullets and cannons and tanks, but there's also a massive informational war. The same narrative that you see these ground troops in Ukraine, these Russian ground troops in Ukraine, believing they're clearing the land of Nazis, that information is being fed to them from their own home country. I don't know why people seem to think that the information that they're reading in English is any more or less true. Every piece of news coming out of the West, every piece of information coming out in the English language is also a giant narrative being shared intentionally to try to undermine the morale and the faithfulness of English-speaking Russians, which somebody somewhere knows exactly how many of those there are. So we have to recognize that we're not getting true information from other side, because there is a strategic value in making sure that there is just the right amount of mis or disinformation out there. Not because someone's trying to lie to Americans, but because someone is trying to influence the way English-speaking Russians think. And in that world, that's exactly why you see so many news articles cited to anonymous sources, government officials who do not want to be named. There's nothing that links back responsibility there, right? There's nothing that can go to court there. But the information still gets released. And that's enough to make Ukrainians believe that the United States is going to help them or that the West is going to help them. It's enough to make Russians think that they're going to lose, and maybe they should just give up now and leave from the battlefield now. We have to understand we are in the middle of a giant information war. The strategy that the United States has taken to support Ukraine is similar to the strategy we took to support Great Britain during World War II. The enactment of the Lend-Lease Act is a perfect example of that. The Lend-Lease Act means that we are lending or leasing equipment to the Ukrainian government in exchange for future payment. So every time a rocket is launched, every time a drone crashes into a tank, that's a bill that Ukraine is just racking up. It's like when you go to a restaurant and you start drinking shots. Sometime the bill will come due. This is exactly what we did when Europe and when Great Britain was in the face of Nazi invasion. We signed the same thing into motion. Do you know that the UK did not pay off the debt from World War II until 2020? They've been paying that debt since the end of World War II. So what we're doing is we're indebting Ukraine against the promise that perhaps they will secure their freedom, which nobody seems to want to talk about what freedom is actually going to look like for Ukrainians, right? What are the true handful of outcomes, the realistic outcomes that could come of this, and which of those outcomes really looks like freedom to them, especially in the face of the fact that they're going to be trillions of dollars in debt to the West for supplying them with the training and the weapons and the food and the med kits and everything else that we're giving them, because none of it's free. It's all coming due. We're a democracy, but we're also a capitalist country. We can't afford to just give things away for free, but we can give things away at a discount. We can give things away layaway, but the bill will come due. And unfortunately, that is not part of the conversation that's being had with the American people. We live in a world right now where there simply is no economic benefit to the parties in power to support Ukraine to that level. And war is a game of economics. The economic benefit of Ukraine is crystal clear in favor of Russia, which is why Putin cannot lose. He will not let himself lose. Short of something completely unexpected, right? I'm talking 60%, 70% probability Ukraine loses. But there's still 20%, 30% probability of the unimaginable happening. Who knows what that might be? An oligarch assassinates Putin, or a nuclear bomb goes off somewhere, or who knows what, right? There's still a chance that something unexpected will happen and change the tide of the war. But when it comes down to the core calculus here, Ukraine is the agricultural bed to support a future Russia. Russia knows, they know they have to have Ukraine. They know that they have to have it to protect themselves against military pressure from the West. They have to have it for agricultural reasons. They have major oil and natural gas pipelines that flow through eastern Ukraine. They cannot let Ukraine fall outside of their sphere of influence. They cannot. The United States doesn't really have any economic vested interest in Ukraine. Ideological points of view and promises aside, there's no economic benefit. And the same thing goes for NATO. NATO has no economic investment in Ukraine. Ukrainian output, Ukrainian food goes to the Middle East and Africa. It doesn't go to Europe. So the West siding with Ukraine is exclusively ideological, and it's putting them in a place where they fight a war with Russia so the whole world can see Russia's capabilities. Ukraine is as sad as it is to say, man, Ukraine is a pawn on a table for superpowers to calculate each other's capacities. Right now, we've only talked about Russia and the United States. We haven't even talked about Iran. We haven't even talked about China, right? It is a pawn on a table. This is a chicken fight so that people get to watch and see what the other trainers are doing. I think they've already got an advantage in the war. The fact that the war is still going on demonstrates the asymmetrical advantage. The fact that Russia has stepped up to the negotiating table with them several times without just turning to you remember what happened in Chechnya? Without turning to Chechnya level, just mass blind destruction, which was another Putin war. To see that those things have happened demonstrates the asymmetric advantage that the West is given. I think the true way to look at the benefit of Ukraine as a shining example of freedom in Europe for the West isn't to understand whether or not they could. They absolutely could. It's the question of how valuable is that in Europe? How valuable is Ukraine? Which before February, nobody even thought about Ukraine. And the people who did know about Ukraine knew that it was an extremely corrupt former Soviet state with 20% of its national population self-identifying as Russian. So to think that it could be a shining example of freedom is accurate. But is it as shining a star as Germany? Is it as shining a star as the UK? Is it as shining a star as Romania? Is it as shining a star as France? Like, it's got a lot of democratic, freedom-based countries in Europe to compete against to be the shining stellar example. And in exchange, on counterpoint to that, it has an extreme amount of strategic value to Russia, which has no interest in making it a shining star of the example of democracy and freedom. Our current administration has the lowest approval ratings of any president in history. So if people were very fond of the war going on in Ukraine, wouldn't that counterbalance some of our upset, some of the dissent coming from the economy and some of the dissent coming from the Great Recession or the Great Resignation and whatever's happening with the down stock market? You would think that people would feel like they're sacrificing for something if they really believed that Ukraine mattered, that they would stand next to the president who is so staunchly driving and leading the West against this conflict. Well, the American people ideologically sympathize with Ukraine, but they really just want their gas prices to go down. They really just want to be able to pay less money at the grocery store for their food. And they most definitely don't want their sons and daughters to die in exchange for Ukrainian freedom. Media discovered that talking about Ukraine wasn't as profitable as talking about something else. The American people who read media or who watch media, they simply became bored reading about news that didn't seem to be changing much. And we turned back into wanting to read about our own economy, and we wanted to hear more about cryptocurrency, and we wanted to hear more about the Kardashians, and that's what we care about. So that's what media writes about. That's how a capitalist market-driven world works, and that's how the United States works. That's why in both red papers and blue papers, red sources and blue sources, you don't see Ukraine being mentioned very much. If anything, I would say that your Republicans are probably more in support of what's happening in Ukraine right now because we're creating new weapon systems. Our military is getting stronger. We're sending these we get to test military systems in combat in Ukraine. That's priceless in the world of the military industrial complex. Being able to field test, combat test a weapon without having to sacrifice your own people is incredibly valuable. You get all the data, you get all the performance metrics, but you don't have to put yourself at risk. That is one of the major benefits of what we're seeing from supporting Ukraine with weapons and with troops. The long-term benefit to what will come of this for the United States, practically speaking, in the lens of national security, through military readiness, through future economic benefits, those are super strong. The geopolitical fight is essentially moot because Ukraine is not a geopolitical player. It was not for 70 years. And after this conflict is over, it will not again. Just think about what you were just saying with the American people's attention span to Twitter and whatever's currently going on. If the Ukraine conflict resolved itself today, in any direction, how many weeks do you think before no one talked about Ukraine anymore? Do you think we would make it 2 weeks? Or do you think we'd make it maybe 7 days? It would be headline news for 1 or 2 days, and then we'd be on to something else. It's just an unfortunate reality of how the world works in a capitalist democracy.